Part 2, the inaugural Alan Saunders lectures, Is Science Enough?
Does not all true love base itself on agreeable perceptions, much more than on representations of utility? Hence, we might in principle be altruistic in just the same spirit as the bee or the man eating his dinner. For there are plenty of evolutionary who likes it but doesn't think about its utility. For there are plenty of evolutionary dynamics in which individuals who bear the cost of assisting their kin, those who have helped them, or assist their neighbours or the collective, do better than those who do not. Nice guys sometimes do finish first, and this should be no more surprising than that less lethal parasites often flourish rather than their greedier but lethal cousins. That's the dynamic whereby diseases such as maximatosis, as you're very familiar with in Australia, I believe, in rabbits tend to become less lethal over time. By the same mechanism, in a world in which we must all hang together or else we all hang separately, those who are adapted to hang together do best. So my first sort of second order or meta lesson is that we must look out for the division between ideology and science, or in other words, between what is said by scientists when they are speaking large and free and interpreting what their results mean for us, and what science says. Anyone studying human nature will already take into their library or laboratory a great many of their own observations. They will also take their own inclinations to one interpretation or another of their experience, as well as the wisdom or myth embodied in their very language and vocabulary. In this area, there is no such thing as the innocent eye. But I think the dangers are greater than this fairly bland observation suggests. There are other places in the study of human nature where this lesson applies, places in which a certain conception of science can distort our understandings. My general message is that it takes a whole picture, a picture of entire agents behaving in different contexts over periods of time, to cement interpretation in place. And that may make us pause over how much understanding of ourselves is actually likely to come out of the neurophysiology laboratory or the zoo or the Pleistocene. I want to suggest a caution about what can be expected from neurophysiology, brain scans, and the rest. We may certainly discover, and I hope we do discover, and I believe we have discovered, endlessly fascinating things about the mechanisms involved in us doing what we do. I'm not anti-science. But we do not thereby discover ready new interpretations or better interpretations of what it is that we do. The neurophysiology itself needs interpretation, and the only way of providing that is by calibrating it against the common behavior that is the starting point of interpretation in any event. In a nutshell, brain writing, even if it's salient and stable and re-identifiable and common to different people, which is by no means always the case, would need interpretation as much as any other text.
You're with Big Ideas here on RN and online at abc.net.au/Radio National. You're listening to the inaugural Alan Saunders Memorial Lecture. British philosopher Simon Blackburn is talking about whether science alone can explain human nature. Scientists often seem to believe that their tools and procedures have made philosophical reflection obsolete. The philosophical armchair is discredited as an aid to reflection on human nature, says Simon Blackburn. Let's return to his lecture delivered last night at the ABC in Brisbane.
The sequencing of the human genome had given an enormous fillip to a kind of genetic determinism. Our genes were to be our fate. That's past. We now know that even diet can influence the methylation of genes, which in turn affect their expression and suppression. A nice example of this brings culture firmly back into the picture, but it also illustrates something important that I want to stress about the contemporary climate of ideas and the contemporary, as it were, sources of authority in the academy. In a deservedly famous experiment at McGill, a neurophysiologist, Michael Meany, found in rats, and this is a quote, the mother's licking activity, they had some rats whose mothers were allowed to lick them and a control group whose mothers didn't. The mother's licking activity had the effect of removing dimmer switches on a gene that shapes stress receptors in the pup's growing brain. The well-licked rats had better developed hippocampi and released less of the stress hormone cortisol, making them calmer when startled. In contrast, the neglected pups released much more cortisol, had less developed hippocampi, and reacted nervously when startled or in new surroundings. Through simple maternal behavior, these mother rats were literally shaping the brains of their offspring. In short, licking and grooming release serotonin in the pup's brain, which activates serotonin receptors in the hippocampus. These receptors send proteins called transcription factors to turn on the gene that inhibits stress responses. Very interesting and a very deservedly famous piece of work. But as with rats, so we can be sure with us. If maternal behavior and diet can make these changes, then so much for any brash confidence that our genes are our fate, or that culture is causally inert. But what interests me more is that there should actually have been no need for detailed neurophysiological understanding of the difference maternal licking and grooming made if we were interested in, as it were, rat nature corresponding to human nature. Before it became accepted that these environmental factors influence the overt behavioral dispositions, because the empirical correlation between maternal behavior and disposition could just as easily have been firmly established without knowledge of the mechanism underlying it. But in the cultural atmosphere in which genes ruled unchallenged, that was not possible. And this feature of our cultural situation is borne out by many reports from psychologists that unless the work they want to do is tacked onto ours with an fMRI scanner or similar neurophysiological measurements, it will not be funded or listened to. These remarks may sound rather high-handed, but I found them borne out a couple of years ago when a website called The Edge, which some of you may have heard of, it's sort of our very high-flown academic arbiter elegantiarum. It's a kind of Uber academy or distiller of all that's great and good and all that everybody wants to make public in contemporary thought. And it published a communique, they actually called it a communique, from a specially invited table of experts, revealing to an expectant and grateful world what science had discovered about our moral natures. They had a 7-man, I apologize on their behalf to women in the audience, panel. It included, by my count, 4 psychologists, two neurologists, and 1 philosopher, which was a sign, I think, of our diminished status in the world. And they were not short of ideas. They issued their communique under 8 banner headlines. And here they are, I quote verbatim. Morality is a natural phenomenon and a cultural phenomenon. 2. Many of its building blocks are innate. 3. Moral judgments are often made intuitively with little deliberation or conscious weighing of alternatives. 4. Conscious moral reasonings play multiple roles in our moral lives. 5. Moral judgments and values are often at odds with actual behavior. 6. Many areas of the brain are recruited for moral cognition, yet there is no moral center in the brain. 7. Morality varies across individuals and cultures. 8. Moral systems support human flourishing to various degrees. Well, who'd have thunk it? Roll over Aristotle, Hume, Smith, Adam Smith, Nietzsche, not to mention Tolstoy, Proust, and the fuddy-duddies who still read them, for here's a new scientific dawn. I don't know how many negotiations went into providing that communique. Maybe the Northern Ireland and Middle Eastern peace processes were picnics by comparison. But yeah, personally I was especially reassured by number 6 of the bouquet, that is that many areas of the brain are recruited for moral cognition, although I did wonder who does the recruiting. Anyhow, I'm very happy to believe that there's no moral centre in the brain, although I would also love to learn if there's a baseball centre or a football centre or a tennis centre just at present. Not to mention, yes, well, never mind. And why stop at 8? How about, here's another one, moral disagreements are often intractable. I just thought that up. Or moral issues often make people hot under the collar. Scientists need have no monopoly of banality. Anyhow, to return to my main theme, I mean, that's just an illustration of the difficulty of translating anything that deserves calling science into anything that deserves calling a contribution to, in this case, moral philosophy, but to the interpretation of human beings, of ourselves, that is. Interpretations need to earn their keep at the tribunal of capacities and behavior. If these capacities and behavior are different, it is very interesting to learn what differences in the brain underpin the diversity. And of course, I am not pretending for one moment there's an independence of the psychology of individuals from their brains. Of course, it's the brains that make it all happen. But what I am saying is that you have to have a firm grip on what does happen before you become very enamored of the story about the subsisting systems that make it happen. For a different example, consider some well-known and fascinating results, absolutely fascinating results, which were made public about 15 years ago by Antonio Damasio and his collaborators on the deficits exhibited by prefrontal patients, that is, people with damage to a particular area of the brain, the ventromedial prefrontal cortex. The clinical observation is that such patients may be perfectly normal in respect to perception, memory, language, skills, and logic, and may also be very, very bad at practical decision-making. And that in turn makes them significantly worse at living any kind of normal life. Damasio's own interpretation of their deficit was in terms of an emotional disability, construed as the inability to somatically mark, as he called it, actual and projected events, in other words, to attach sort of ticks and crosses to them, motivational ticks and crosses to them. And that in turn seemed to lend some support both to an old idea of William James about the emotions, that they were a kind of perception of bodily arousal, and to give ammunition to those, including myself, who follow Hume in supposing that emotion has a greater role in practical decision-making than its nebulous competitor, reason. However, there are rival interpretations of the data. One is that prefrontal patients lack the skill to perform a kind of time travel, both remembering past experiences with themselves as the subject, in the way normal people might remember eating a nice or nasty meal, and imagining future experiences with themselves as the subject, in the way we can imagine again eating the same meal and then anticipating the episode with either pleasure or aversion. Now, I offer no opinion on that debate, which can be quite intricate, but I merely cite it as an example where the facts of behavior and its neural substrate may be relatively clear, but the question of interpretation is very open indeed. I would like to finish by turning to a practical question. Is human nature obsolete? Can we anticipate a future in which it becomes itself a variable that we can control and design, tailoring it to human needs and desires with the prospect of a better future for all of us? Can we set about beautiful design where nature has merely kludged? Well, if the question were whether we can change human nature, then the blunt response has to be that we already know how to do it, one person at a time. We do it rather like rats do it, by licking and grooming, or slightly more grandly, we call that educating. We do it when we socialize our children, when we teach them our language, when we introduce them to property and promises, forbearances and cooperations, conventions and norms, and the millions of little capacities that eventually fit them for their lives as grown-ups. This is an agonizing process, as parents know, and of course we endlessly debate and tinker with the choices in front of educators. We don't even know the best way to teach children to read, for example, and of course there may be no such thing as the best way. There may be only a multitude of ways, some more suitable for some children and others for others. That's culture. Doubtless pharmacological interventions can change our nature. It is widely supposed that large amounts of hallucinogenic drugs can cause or trigger schizophrenia, for example. Large doses of the Class A drug Ritalin make naughty children docile, at least for a time. Probably so does banging their head against a brick wall. And presumably, as eugenicists hoped, selective breeding or genetic engineering might in principle eventually change the gene pool and lead to different aspects of people, or perhaps even different kinds of people. Should we be frightened at these prospects? I'm talking about Kant's pragmatic anthropology, that is, human nature, what man can and should make of himself, not about the elimination or suppression of physical disease and illness, to which some perhaps simple genetic peculiarity might make some people prone, Huntington's chorea and Duchenne's muscular dystrophy being the best known public examples. Few people could quarrel with interventions to change or eliminate those. Some people even talk of the aging process as a kind of disease that a suitable genetic modification might halt or even reverse, giving us a fountain of perpetual youth. That's more radical, and we would doubtless discuss the pros and cons of such an intervention were it on the horizon. But as I try to stress, it's psychologies that interest us when we talk of human nature. So we're talking of changes that might give us large-scale, heritable psychological dispositions that improve us beyond our ancestors. And the question is whether we can imagine a genetic engineering not to remove deficits and disease, but to improve human nature, rather as eugenic programs were hoped to do so around a century ago. We could imagine enhancements producing people who are, for instance, more just, less selfish, more courageous, more intelligent, more imaginative, more prudent, more humorous, and better company. Well, of course, the aims of old eugenic programs might strike us as comical when they were not wicked, but I'm sure that today many people congratulate themselves on being able to do better. They, in the old days, ushered in a nightmare, but we in the 21st century will wave a wand. We know how to aim it.
Here endeth part 2 of the inaugural Alan Saunders lectures. Is science enough? Apparently not.